What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today, for the kickoff to the 7 Nights of Halloween special that I'm doing here on this channel, we are going to be discussing Halloween origins. To kick off our countdown to this Halloween special, I thought it would be cool to talk about Halloween generally, the history of it, and whatever else comes to mind regarding everyone's most favoriteest night of the year during spooky season. There's no doubt that, regardless of whether or not you celebrate Halloween, the night of October 31st is by far the most chillingly atmospheric night of the entire year. All across the world, kids and sometimes even adults dress up as all sorts of creatures, creepy crawlies, their favorite comic book movie characters, their favorite movie characters, and so much more. And they go out into the world hoping to get a treat instead of a trick from friends, neighbors, and strangers in their communities. The treat they're looking for, of course, at least in most cases, is candy. It's all done in good fun and with good humor, and there are unspoken rules in all neighborhoods and communities that most people do their best to abide by. Where I come from, it's only acceptable to be out trick-or-treating before 7 p.m. if you have or are a very small child. And if the porch light isn't on, or if there isn't some type of decoration up on the house, you pass by it with the understanding that, for whatever reason, the people in that home are not participating in Halloween that year, and that they aren't passing out candy. However, in past centuries, Halloween was anything but a night where you would want to be out having the time of your life and or roaming the streets at nighttime. In fact, it was just the opposite, and long before Halloween as we know it existed, there was, of course, All Hallows Eve. All Hallows Eve was inexplicably and for whatever reason linked to the resurfacing of the dead wherever it was they were said to be coming from. People were scared. They definitely weren't in a joking and joyful, let's dress up and hit the town type of mood. There wasn't even any candy in sight back then, and if there was, no one was celebrating anything by eating or passing any of it out. So it wasn't until the early part of the 16th century that the term All Hallows Eve started being used anyway. And while I know many people think that Halloween is a pagan holiday and has nothing at all to do with Christianity, there's another group of people who believe that it actually has its roots firmly planted in the domain of Christianity and its teachings. So, which is right? All Hallows Eve is in direct association with what? What is it the eve of? Well, it's said that it's the eve of November 1st, All Saints' Day, which is a very Christian holiday. And some people believe that proves that the holiday has its roots firmly planted in the domain of Christianity and its teaching. I am here today to tell you that while Christianity is certainly responsible, believe it or not, for the model of Halloween that we all have today, the roots of it date way further back than that, and back to a time when, you guessed it, paganism actually ruled. It is not a Christian holiday, except Christianity is responsible for the way we celebrate now. In fact, it wasn't until the 8th century when Pope Gregory III designated November 1st as All Saints' Day and started incorporating some of the ancient traditions of the festival of Samhain. Of course, it's only natural that due to the fog of the time and the inability to document anything beyond writing it down on paper that could eventually evaporate into nothing, a lot of the earliest celebrations of Halloween have been lost. What we do know played a large role in the development of our modern-day holiday was the Gaelic festival of Samhain. Samhain was celebrated by people in Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, and Wales from at least as far back as the 10th century. In fact, they all celebrated their new year on the 1st of November. That's what it's the eve of. The night before the new year, according to their beliefs and traditions, was a night when the boundary was most blurred, that being the boundary between the realms of the living and the dead, and I'm sure most of you know what the quote-unquote veil it means, as that's what we have come to refer to it as, and it is a term that's very much overused, in my opinion, almost to an annoying degree nowadays. It would begin on the 31st and last a full 24 hours, and it was really used to mark the beginning of the darker months that laid ahead and the inevitable ice cold and lean winter months. The winter back then was a literal season of death because so many people wouldn't come out the other side into spring alive. Also, The concept of the dead returning was a lot different back then too than that which we see in our modern times and in the movies and things like that. In addition to causing general mischief and damaging the season's crops, the Celts thought that the otherworldly spirits having returned to our earthy realm also made it easier for the Druids, who were the Celtic priests, to be able to more accurately predict the future. Like they were bringing knowledge over from the other side. These people were completely and totally dependent on the natural world. And so they relied on those predictions to provide them with a sense of comfort and safety during the long, cold, and brutally harsh winter ahead of them each year. During the celebration, the Celts wore costumes that typically consisted of animal heads or skins, and they would entertain one another by trying to tell each other's fortunes. When the celebration was over, they would go home and relight the fires of their hearths, which they would have extinguished earlier that same evening. But they would use the fire from the sacred bonfire because they thought that it would help protect them during those winter months. For the Gaels, it was a time for people to invite the souls of their loved ones into their homes for celebration and a hearty feast. While it was done with them having the desire to see their departed loved ones again, it was also done a little bit out of fear too. Obviously, spirits don't eat as humans do. And so it was more of a time of hope for the grieving members of the family to feel closer to those they loved who went before them, that they would be with them that entire day and join in however they could in the festivities. It was also done as a symbol of welcoming. Something else I think we should discuss here, though, is that Samhain was basically an open invitation for all friendly spirits to come and roam freely with the living. Gaelic teachings and folklore made it very clear that some of the souls of the dead that took the people up on those invitations were the furthest thing from friendly you could get. So, how did the Gaels and everyone else avoid being noticed by the spirits of those with whom maybe they didn't have the best and most pleasant relationship with when they were living? Or, in other cases, how did they make sure that the spirits of the malignant dead didn't recognize the living in general so as not to try to jump into their bodies or whatever else the people back then thought lower vibrational or evil, as they would have called it, spirits did? Well, many of the Gaels elected to wear costumes in order to fool the deceased lurking among them. It's quite brilliant. They would camouflage themselves as the very creatures of the night that they were fearful would be hunting them down. They thought it helped them to avoid the detection of the predatory souls of the dear departed. However, by AD 43, the Roman Empire had conquered the majority of Celtic territory, and throughout the course of the almost 400 years that they ruled over the Celtic lands, two festivals of Roman origins were combined with the ancient Celt festival of Samhain, and that's another step closer to where we are today. One of the Roman festivals that it was combined with was called PARALYSI, which was a day sometime in late October, but not necessarily on the 31st, when the Romans would pay homage to their deceased loved ones and ancestors. It's also said that it was a basic commemoration of the passing of the dead in general. The second Roman festival was to honor the goddess Pomona, the goddess of fruit and trees. The symbol of Pomona is the apple, and the incorporation of this celebration of that particular goddess at the time of Samhain explains the tradition of bobbing for apples. On May 13th, AD 609, Pope Boniface IV dedicated the Pantheon in Rome in honor of all Christian martyrs, and the Catholic feast of All Martyrs' Day was established in the Western Church at that time. As I already mentioned, it was then that Pope Gregory III expanded the festival to include all saints as well as all martyrs, and he also moved observance from the 13th of May, for whatever reason, to the 1st of November. By the 9th century, the influence of Christianity had spread into the Celtic lands, where it gradually blended with and supplanted older Celtic rites. In AD 1000, the Church made November 2nd All Souls' Day, a day to honor the dead. It's widely believed by historians today that the church was attempting to replace the Celtic Festival of the Dead with a related church-sanctioned holiday. All Souls' Day was celebrated similarly to Samhain, with big bonfires, parades, and dressing up in costumes as saints, angels, and even devils. The All Saints' Day celebration was also called All Hallows or All Hallowmas, from Middle English Al Hallowmas, meaning All Saints' Day. I don't know how to pronounce the name of that language. And the night before it, the traditional night of Samhain in the Celtic religion began to be called All Hallows' Eve and eventually Halloween. In colonial America, the celebration of Halloween was extremely limited due to the rigid Protestant belief systems of most of the colonists that were there. Halloween back then was most commonly celebrated in Maryland, as well as a couple of other southern states, but really nowhere else in the United States at that time. As the beliefs and customs of different European ethnic groups and the American Indians meshed, a distinctly American version of Halloween began to emerge. The first celebrations included play parties, which were public events held to celebrate the harvest. Neighbors would share stories of the dead, tell each other's fortunes, and sing and dance. Colonial Halloween festivities also featured the telling of ghost stories and mischief-making of all kinds. By the middle of the 19th century, annual autumn festivals were common, but Halloween was not yet celebrated everywhere in the country. In the second half of the 19th century, America was flooded with new immigrants. These new immigrants, especially the millions of Irish fleeing the Irish potato famine, helped to popularize the celebration of Halloween nationally. But what about trick-or-treating? Borrowing from European traditions, Americans began to dress up in costumes and go house to house asking for food or money, a practice that eventually became today's trick-or-treat tradition. There was actually a time when it was referred to as souling, and sometimes where I'm from, it's simply called Halloweening. At that time, though, there were young women who believed that on Halloween they could divine the name or appearance of their future husband by doing tricks with yarn, apple parings, or mirrors. In the late 1800s, there was a move in America to mold Halloween into a holiday more about community and neighborly get-togethers than about ghosts, pranks, and witchcraft. At the turn of the century, Halloween focused on games, food of the season, and festive costumes. This is also around the time when parents were encouraged by newspapers and community leaders to take anything frightening or grotesque out of Halloween celebrations. Because of these efforts, Halloween lost most of its superstitious and religious overtones by the beginning of the 20th century. By the 1920s and 1930s, Halloween had become a secular but community-centered holiday with parades and town-wide Halloween parties as the featured entertainment. Despite the best efforts of many schools and communities, vandalism began to plague some celebrations in many communities during this time. By the 1950s, town leaders had successfully limited vandalism, and Halloween had evolved into a holiday directly, mainly aimed at the young. Due to the high numbers of young children during the 50s baby boom, parties moved from town civic centers into the classroom or home where they could be more easily accommodated, meaning the children. Between 1920 and 1950, the centuries-old practice of trick-or-treating also was revived. Trick-or-treating was a relatively inexpensive way for an entire community to share the Halloween celebration together. In theory, families could also prevent tricks being played on them by providing the neighborhood children with small treats. So with that, a new American tradition was born, and it has continued to grow. Today, Americans spend an estimated $6 billion on Halloween annually, making it the country's second largest commercial holiday after Christmas. I'm not surprised at that number with how expensive costumes are. The American Halloween tradition of trick-or-treating probably dates back to the early All Souls parades in England. During the festivities, poor citizens would beg for food, and families would give them pastries called soul cakes in return for their promise to pray for the family's dead relatives. The distribution of soul cakes was encouraged by the church as a way to replace the ancient practice of leaving food and wine out for roaming spirits. This is where the practice I mentioned earlier, which was referred to as going a-souling or souling, was eventually taken up by children who would visit the houses in their neighborhood and be given ale, food, and money. On Halloween, when it was believed that ghosts came back to the earthly world, people thought that they would encounter ghosts if they left their home. To avoid being recognized by these ghosts, people would wear masks when they left their homes after dark so that the ghosts would mistake them for their fellow spirits. They obviously knew nothing of energy, but it ended up being a really fun holiday, right? On Halloween, in order to keep ghosts away from their houses, people would place bowls of food outside of their homes to appease the ghosts and prevent them from attempting to enter. Halloween has always been a holiday filled with mystery, magic, and superstition. It began as a Celtic end-of-summer festival during which people felt especially close to deceased relatives, loved ones, and friends. For these friendly spirits, they set places at the dinner table, left treats on doorsteps and along the side of the road, and lit candles to help loved ones find their way back to the spirit world. Today's Halloween ghosts are often depicted as more fearsome and malevolent, and our customs and superstitions are a lot scarier too. In my opinion, and the opinion of most people who studied this, we avoid crossing paths with black cats, afraid that they might bring us bad luck. This idea has its roots in the Middle Ages, when many people believed that witches avoided detection by turning themselves into black cats. We try not to walk under ladders for the same reason. This is to avoid bad luck as well. And that superstition may have come from the ancient Egyptians who believed that triangles were sacred. It also may have something to do with the fact that walking under a leaning ladder tends to be fairly unsafe. And there were probably a lot of accidents that occurred because people were doing this, and it ended up becoming an unlucky thing. And around Halloween especially, we do try to avoid breaking mirrors, stepping on cracks in the road, or spilling salt. I try to avoid doing these things all year long. I had no idea that a lot of people only avoid these things on Halloween. What do you guys think about that? Let me know in the comments. Before we end, let's talk about some lesser known rituals of Halloween from decades and centuries past. What about the traditions and things aside from dressing up and trick-or-treating? The traditions that seem to have been completely lost to time and history. Many of the rituals and traditions that I'm going to briefly mention now focus on the living and on the future, instead of on the deceased and the past. In particular, many had to do with helping young women identify their future husbands and reassuring them that they would someday, with luck or possibly by next Halloween, be married. In 18th century Ireland, a matchmaking cook might bury a ring in her mashed potatoes on Halloween night, hoping to bring true love to the diner who found it. In Scotland, fortune tellers recommended that an eligible young woman name a hazelnut for each of her suitors and then toss the nuts into the fireplace. The nut that burned to ashes rather than popping or exploding, the story went, represented the girl's future husband, and then she would know his name. In some versions of this legend, the opposite was true. The nut that burned away symbolized a love that would not last. Another tale had it that if a young woman ate a sugary concoction made out of walnuts, hazelnuts, and nutmeg before bed on Halloween night, she would dream about her future husband. Young women tossed apple peels over their shoulders, hoping that the peels would fall on the floor in the shape of their future husband's initials, tried to learn about their futures by peering at egg yolks floating in a bowl of water, and stood in front of mirrors in darkened rooms, holding candles and looking over their shoulders for their husbands' faces. Other rituals were a little more competitive. At some Halloween parties, the first guest to find a burr on a chestnut hunt would be the first to marry. At others, the first successful apple bobber would be the first down the aisle. Of course, whether you're asking for romantic advice or trying to avoid 7 years of bad luck, each one of these Halloween superstitions relies on the goodwill of the very same spirits whose presence the early Celts felt so keenly. Personally, Halloween is a very, very busy time of year for me, not only as a mom, but as a paranormal nonfiction author, a medium paranormalist, and of course, YouTube creator in the paranormal community. But I wanted to just take some time and go through the history of so many people's favorite holiday just for some fun and because it sounded very interesting to me. Many families, just like with Christmas and Thanksgiving, have their very own rituals and traditions for the holiday and, of course, their very own beliefs. As always, I say, as long as it's all in good fun and it isn't hurting anyone, to each his own and live your own life. I may talk some more, I'm not sure yet, about the types of things we shouldn't be doing on Halloween or at any other time of the year, like last year when we discussed why we shouldn't be messing with Ouija boards and other divining tools. But for the most part, the scripts I wrote for this 7 nights of Halloween have to do with demonic possession, demonic activity, demonic demons. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me, and if you enjoyed hanging out with one another in the premiere. Now, this is much shorter than my normal videos, but this is 7 extra videos that I am doing this week so that you guys can see this face every single night leading up to the day after Halloween. Because it's such a busy season for me, I was a week behind in my head and didn't get started soon enough. Typical Gemma, I know. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be safe this Halloween. If nobody told you today, I believe in you. You are worth it. You can do it. Don't let anyone tell you you can't. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger and happy Halloween.